This month marks the 100th year since the grotesque act of domestic terrorism known as the Tulsa Race Massacre. The 100th year. This massacre occurred on May 31st and June 1st, 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, if you're like most Americans, you never learned about this vicious attack in school. In fact, you may have never heard of it at all. But that is all about to change. On this centennial anniversary, elected officials, including the President of the United States, entertainers, and activists around the country are recognizing and paying tribute to the hundreds of Black residents who lost their lives and property in what is widely believed to be the most extreme incidents of white racial violence against African Americans in modern U.S. history. Today, we are joining the nation in paying tribute. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Over 2 days in late May 1921, white residents and law enforcement agents in Tulsa, Oklahoma, torched, burned, and destroyed over 1,000 Black businesses and killed hundreds of Black men, women, and children. For more than 50 years, the massacre was erased from the history books by whites in Oklahoma and the U.S. government. Now, experts say this erasure was out of concern for responsibility, guilt, reparations, and restitution. For entirely different reasons, the massacre was also buried in the narrative of African Americans. Like many racial atrocities, the pain, the trauma, and humiliation was just too much to bear witness to. The 2019 HBO series Watchmen and a series of well-researched books by scholars brought the historic travesty of the Tulsa Race Massacre into modern mainstream conversations. This weekend, President Biden travels to Oklahoma while John Legend and Stacey Abrams head a primetime network special. Now, how do we make sense of this unimaginable assault on a Black prosperous community of over 13,000? How do we honor those who were brutally killed and make whole the remaining survivors, descendants, and those experiencing ongoing trauma from America's racist past? Here for my leadoff panel is one of the country's leading Tulsa historians, Dr. Scott Ellsworth. He is a professor at the University of Michigan and a New York Times best-selling author. In 1992, Dr. Ellsworth wrote one of the first comprehensive books on the Tulsa Race Massacre. His latest book, The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice, was released a week ago. Here this morning, Dr. Ellsworth. Your new book, The Groundbreaking: An American City and the Search for Justice, is literally right off the press, just dropped on May 18th. And I'm so super excited to have you joining us this morning because the praise and the accolades around this book have just been amazing. One of Oprah's Daily's 20 of the best books to pick up for May. One of the Oklahoman's 15 books to help you learn about the Tulsa Massacre. I think you have written the definitive book on the Tulsa race riots. So I'm just so ecstatic that you're going to help us understand why this 100th anniversary, and I say not anniversary in a positive way, but why we are here today talking about the Tulsa race riots. Help us understand, Dr. Ellsworth, what this anniversary is about. Why are we talking about something that happened 100 years ago?
Thank you so much, Areva. It's great to be on the show. I think there's two things that strike me. First is what we now call the Tulsa Race Massacre was just a gigantic event. I mean, the scale is hard for people to conceive. In the course of 16 hours, more than 1,000 African-American homes and businesses were looted and burned to the ground by a white mob with the help of the Tulsa police and the National Guard. More than 10,000 people were made homeless. To this day, we don't know how many people died. I think reasonable estimates go from somewhere in the 70s to as high as 300, but we just don't know. And Greenwood was this prosperous, vibrant African American community. There were 2 movie theaters, there were 2 newspapers, a dozen churches, 30 restaurants, 30 grocery stores and meat markets, 2 schools, a public library, a hospital, and it was all wiped off the face of the earth. So that's one reason. This is a huge event. But the other thing is that for 50 years, this event was actively covered up and buried and not talked about. And it's taken us about 50 years to get this story out again. So this is it's a centennial. It's a time to reflect, and it's been a long time coming.
Yeah, Doc Ellsworth, when I think about something as huge as you've just helped put in perspective for us, and I know that your new book is basis of documentaries that are on the National Geographic Channel, on CNN, on the History Channel, I can't help but wonder, why did it take, as you just said, 50 years for us to get to this point where we are talking about this, where it's on, cable networks, where, it's specials are happening on major networks, celebrities, everybody's talking about it now. Why did it take 50 years?
Well, it took 50 years because of a couple of reasons, one of which is in the white community in Tulsa, the story was actively suppressed for nearly a half century. Official records and documents were stolen and destroyed. Tulsa's 2 daily white newspapers just refused to write about it for nearly a half century. People who started to research this as late as the 1970s had their lives threatened, had their livelihoods threatened. It was something that was kept out of the history books, something you just don't talk about. But the irony, Areva, is that it also wasn't talked about publicly in the African American community either. And I think the reason why is to think about these survivors. I knew survivors in the 1990s who were still suffering from PTSD, from all of the horrible things that had happened to them. And Tulsa Massacre survivors, like Holocaust survivors, World War II veterans, they often didn't want to talk about these horrific events that had happened to them and burdened their children and grandchildren with it. So it took a long time, but Don Ross, who was a very important state legislator here in Greenwood, he helped break through the taboo in the Black community in the late 1960s, been a very important figure. My first book helped in 1982. So it's been a long time and a long effort of us to finally get that story out.
Yeah, and we're going to talk some, Dr. Ellsworth, about what was the catalyst for the race riot, and get into the some of the granular facts about what happened. But before we do that, I just want to ask you, I know you said there was a state legislator in the 60s that helped kind of demystify, help African Americans start to talk about this more. Your first book, obviously considered one of the foremost books on the Tulsa race riots, but why today all the interest? This moment, because this could have happened 5 years ago, could have happened 2 years ago, could happen 2 years from now. But why today, May 21st, 25th, this moment in history?
Well, I think there's a couple reasons. And, I think, one reason as well is the Watchmen, series on HBO really brought that to the world. And when that first issue came out, or first episode came out, I heard from people in England and, in Europe and elsewhere, why haven't we heard about this before? But the other reason is also because of the murder of George Floyd, and also the murders, the well-known murders from Trayvon Martin on, of others, captured on cell phones. And it's caused a national conversation to happen in this country about racism, about violence against people of color, and we're catching part of that as well too. I think, we're at this inflection point where Americans, I think, are a little more open, some of them, not all of them, but more open to learning about the bad parts of the past as well as the good parts.
Yeah, and I do want to mention that your book that you just referenced, Death in the Promised Land, has been, called the first ever comprehensive history of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, and that came out around the 90s, right?
In 1982, actually.
82. Yeah. So again, thank you for writing that. But from 1921 to 1982, so the first comprehensive book comes out almost 60 years later. Wow, that's pretty incredible. So Dr. Ellsworth, now take us back. Take us back to 1921, and first tell us, what was this community, Greenwood, this community in Tulsa, what was it like before this May 25th incident, a riot actually occurred?
Well, it was an astonishing place. It was an incredibly vibrant community. It was a place where the American dream was working for Black people. Tulsa, in Tulsa in 1921, about 10% of the population was African American. So there were 10,000 people growing every day in Greenwood. It was a city where they had 2 theaters, the Dreamland and the Dixie. One sat 750, the other 1,000. There were 2 newspapers. There were 2 African American schools, a public library, a hospital, a post office branch. There were more than 30 restaurants serving everything.
And all of these businesses were owned
Black
by
owned.
African Americans.
Yes, or 98% of them.
Let me ask you this, Dr. Ellsworth. Back in 1921, was this community considered the Black Wall Street, or did that title and that kind of moniker come later?
That name really came later. It was known as Greenwood, and a deep Greenwood. The name Greenwood came because so many people from Mississippi Mississippi Delta migrated into Oklahoma and into Tulsa, and they named it after Greenwood. But it was this, it was a place where things were working. Incredibly vibrant place where ideas were shared. There were book clubs, missionary societies, social groups. W.E.B. Du Bois had come and spoken Tulsa before. This is where this incredible brand new music of jazz is getting played. I mean, it was an astonishing place.
I'm feeling like this is Harlem. Is this like the when you think about what you've just described, the image that I have in my mind is Harlem in the early 1900s.
It's Harlem on a smaller scale. It might be a little Harlem. There were more prosperous African American communities, in Durham and Atlanta and Chicago and certainly in New York City. But for a city of its size, Tulsa was astonishing. I mean, the Stratford Hotel had 54 rooms. I'm sure this is the largest Black-owned hotel between Chicago and Los Angeles. I mean, so this was a place that people knew about. It was a place where you had a chance to get ahead.
And what was the relationships like between Blacks and whites in Tulsa, again, pre-riot? Because here you have all this Black prosperity. Were the white neighbors receptive? Were they, working in collaboration with the Black entrepreneurs and business owners, or was there hostility?
Well, I think that's a complicated question. It's important to remember that not everyone in Greenwood by any means was wealthy. You had a small class of entrepreneurs that did really, really well, who lived in modern 1- and 2-story wooden homes, who owned cars and pianos and chandeliers and all of that. You also had another class of African-American entrepreneurs, businesswomen and businessmen who served a Black clientele exclusively. But the vast majority of people who lived in Greenwood, the adults worked in the white community in service jobs, during the day as cooks, as maids, as dishwashers, ditch diggers and whatnot. But they came home and they got a good paycheck, and they came home and they spent their money in Greenwood. And that allowed for the commercial district to flourish. Now, then as well as now, white people tend not to go to Black neighborhoods. So there's not going to be a lot of knowledge. We know that there was some jealousy. I mean, that happens today. If you're an African American driving a Lexus or something, what's going to happen? You're going to get pulled over. You're going to get harassed. Those things kind of happen. So the idea of African Americans having nice homes and having, automobiles, that's going to make a certain class of white people very jealous. But the real key is to remember the era. This is a really perilous time for Black people. This is the time of the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan, the largest terrorist organization in American history. Lynchings are still going on. The numbers are going down. but the barbarity is going up. In the United States, you had people burned at the stake in the early 20th century. And we also have these events, and everybody called them race riots in those days. And black people, white people, where you have some sort of a racial incident that then leads to white mobs attacking African Americans in downtown areas and invading black communities, looting, shooting, and burning. These were happening all over the place. So all of that was in the air in Tulsa in 1921.
So what I have read and what's out for public, consumption is that this was all started because a young black teenager, a shoe shine boy at the time they called them, goes into a building and a white woman who's an elevator operator is in this building, and he comes running out the building, and then there's this kind of game of telephone where people are saying somehow that he attacked her, did something to her, and that is what, is the catalyst for this riot. Is that factually accurate?
Yeah, I would say in general it is. I mean, the young man's name was Dick Rowland. He was 19 years old. He would often go into this building because there was a quote, colored restroom on the top floor. And in those days, you had young white teenagers as female teenagers as elevator operators. So we think that he tripped as he entered the elevator and stuck out his hands to break his fall, that he probably caught Sarah Page, the 17-year-old elevator operator, on her shoulder. She screamed out of shock. He ran out. And but nobody seemed to be super worried about it. The police were summoned, but they didn't go and arrest him immediately. They do the next morning. But the wheels of justice are slowly turning. Sarah Page would not press charges. We just don't think anything happened. But the real incident is that Tulsa's white afternoon newspaper, the Tulsa Tribune, prints this front page story claiming that Rowland had, sexually assaulted Page, that he scratched her face, tore her clothes, tried to rape her, and then in a now missing but infamous editorial titled "To Lynch Negro Tonight." And as soon as the Tribune hit the streets at 3 o'clock, within a half an hour, there's lynch talk on the streets of Tulsa. That then grows into a lynch mob, 100, 200, 500, 800. By 9:30 that night, there might be 1,000 whites outside the courthouse whose jail this young man is held, demanding that the sheriff turn him over. But, as soon as this event happened, word hit Greenwood as to what's going on. And at 9:30, a group of 75 African-American World War I vets, all of whom were armed, got into cars. They drove down to the courthouse, presented themselves to the sheriff, and said, "We're here to help you defend the prisoner." He sent them away as they're leaving. An elderly white man tried to wrestle a gun away from one of the black vets. The shot went off, and the massacre began.
So, Dr. Ellsworth, as I was doing the research for today's show, I read that account, and that account is in your book. That's part of, and I know that you did extensive research, firsthand interviews with survivors, reviewing all the records. You talked about the newspaper, so I know that and all the reviews about both of your books is that they're so extensively and accurately researched. But I also read this account that some historians reject that explanation about the interaction between Rowland and this young lady, Miss Page, and they say that this was a planned attack by the government. And they point to the destruction, the planes that were loaded with firebombs, the city ordinances that hampered rebuilding efforts, the internment camps that were already in place. They talk about the white citizens that were deputized and given weapons by law enforcement, and they point to all of that to say this couldn't have just been a spontaneous response to this, as you said, the paper putting out this salacious story, misinformation, but that this was planned. What do you say to those, to that explanation of this riot?
Sure, and it's not just that. People claim that actually Dick Rowland and Sarah Page were lovers, that Sarah Page wasn't in the courthouse, that Sheriff McCullough had them onto a train already to Kansas City, where they lived as man and wife openly in Kansas in 1920s America. The problem with all these things is they may satisfy, there's two things. They may satisfy certain yearnings. And yeah, that's really what it is. They're covering up. But the whole point is evidence. If you don't have evidence to show it, it's just a theory. And there's no evidence that Dick Rowland was not in the courthouse. There's no evidence that internment camps were set up ahead of time. There's simply no evidence for that. And that's where the rubber meets the road. I mean, if somebody can prove it, that's great, and they should. And they should provide the evidence. But if it's not there, the narrative that we have, and this is not a narrative that's strictly Tulsa. There was a young African American who was accused of rape in Waco, Texas. 2,000 whites burned him at the stake, okay? Tortured him and burned him at the stake. A similar event happened in Omaha in 1919. The white mob was so angry and trying to get at this alleged black rapist that they almost murdered the mayor, the white mayor, who tried to get them to go home. So if you don't just look at one town, but if you look at this in the larger sweep of American history, what happened in Tulsa, the severity of what happened in Tulsa wasn't matched in these other communities, but you have the same process having itself. Look, if someone can prove that this was pre-planned, I'm all for it, but you got to produce the evidence.
Yeah, I want to bring into the conversation now, Dr. Ellsworth, Kavin Ross. He's a native of Tulsa, and he's a descendant of a family that was actually victimized during the massacre. He, too, is, like you, on a mission to find some of these unmarked graves of victims. Welcome to the show, Mr. Ross. How are you today?
I'm doing fine, and how are you?
I'm fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. I know from what I've read about you and your family is that your great-grandfather was the owner of one of these Black-owned businesses called the Zulu Lounge.
Yes.
So you can trace your family, your roots back to descendants who were living in this Greenwood community. How did you first learn about this massacre, since Dr. Ellsworth is telling us that it was really pushed under the rug? No one talked about it, even Black folks in Tulsa. So how did you learn about it?
Well, I'm perhaps in the city of Tulsa, probably one of the few children who knew about the riot based on my father's magazine, the Oklahoma Impact magazine, which was a type of format like that of an Albany. It was updated the community about all the goings on in the Black community of Tulsa and different stories. And I remember as a child seeing this magazine, which marked the 50th anniversary of the so-called riot of 1921. And I remember flipping through the pages and seeing all these images that were just powerful. And as I read through the stories, I didn't believe that such a thing would happen in my life. And in a spirit of entrepreneurship, my brothers and I would go door to door in our new neighborhood, which we were in a predominantly white neighborhood, and we would go door to door selling these newspapers, those magazines. And so I didn't know that much about it until I got into high school, when I saw at least half of a paragraph in the Oklahoma historical history book, where it's just a little bit over a paragraph. But what amazed me in the same history book that I'm supposed to be taught the history of Oklahoma, chapter after chapter of the history of the Klan. And so my studies even to the point when I got into college, when that's when I began to know about what happened in my hometown. And it was other people outside Oklahoma that told me the story of my hometown. And I was just amazed. And I think for me, it's been like a godsend after spending 15 years in Houston, Texas, to feel like I had a calling to come back home. And I came back home just in time.
And Dr. Ellsworth, how common is Kavin's story that he, his family lived in Greenwood, was victimized by the rioters, but yet that history wasn't passed down from generation to generation? Well, I think you're on mute for some reason, Dr. Ellsworth.
There we go. Sorry. It is common, but I do have to give a shout out to Kavin, and also Kavin's dad, Don Ross, and Kavin's father probably did more than any other single individual in helping to get the story of the massacre out, breaking through the taboos. And Kavin has been something who has really kept the search for the mass graves alive for 20 years. So this is very important. But the reality is this, I don't think it's that unusual. I'm 67. I know descendants who are my age who didn't find out about the massacre, even though their grandparents had lost their homes and businesses, didn't find out about them until they were in their 40s or 50s. So, it was something you just didn't want to talk about. And of course, white people didn't want to talk about for different reasons, but it was Kavin, wouldn't you say, for a number of survivors, and I knew survivors in the 1990s that were still suffering from PTSD, and they just didn't want to burden their children and grandchildren with these horrible stories.
Oh yes, most definitely. Even within my family, I know over the years when my grandmother was alive, and my uncles and my father would question my great-grandmother about what happened to our, what happened to all the property that they once had. Could you tell us what happened? And she'll just get mad and frustrated and walk out of the room and just, just wanted to leave the family gathering because it stirred up so much emotion. And it wasn't until like a few years ago when I realized the role of my great-grandparents' businesses on Greenwood. I had studied everybody else's story, and basically, in a nutshell, it was like that of a conspiracy of silence. White folks didn't want to talk about it because it was an embarrassment to the city. Black folks didn't want to talk about it because those people who committed those atrocities were still around and were threatening another riot. And so, as one of the survivors that I helped interview along with Commissioner Eddie Fagates, talked about, they would get together and have to whisper in their own kitchen to talk about the sort of details that happened in Tulsa. And they didn't want to talk about it because they didn't want their children to get angry and start talking about it and cause another incident with many of those folks who were around threatening another such incident to occur. So it was a conspiracy science. And many of the survivors that we had interviewed, they were at 5, 10. Someone was a teenager at the time, to get those details of what happened in 1921 from a child's perspective, unlocking all of this information and thoughts and trauma from a child's perspective. It just was just horrific for them to tell that stories.
Yeah, and I know that both of you, I know, Kavin, you are the chair of a committee overseeing the city's search for mass graves. And I know, Dr. Ellsworth, in your new book, you focus a lot on the aftermath of the riot. And you, too, the book is really, kind of a detective's, kind of a mystery story in terms of trying to find these grave sites, these graves that have not been identified. Help us understand, Dr. Ellsworth. You're a historian, you're a scholar. Why is that so important now, 100 years later, to identify those graves?
Well, I think it's always been important, but I think it's important to remember that the massacre victims that we're looking for, they were buried while their loved ones were being held under armed guard. The families never found out what happened to their uncle, their brother, their son, their aunt. They weren't told where these people were buried. They were hastily buried by the white civic authorities. And the records telling, if there were any records, a lot of those records have disappeared. And to me, it's as if these people were thrown away. Look, these are all murder victims, and they deserve a decent burial. So it has been our intention, we're going to exhume this mass grave, begin that process next week. We'll be able to study the remains, the forensic scientists, the osteologists, this other, incredible team of people that we have, be able to hopefully extract DNA, and we might be able to identify some of these people and be able to reunite their remains in a way with their family. But I suspect that we won't know who a lot of these people are. We'll know their relative age, their gender, how they died, and whatnot. on, and the idea is to rebury them with honor and then to appropriately memorialize them. And they won't just simply represent victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre, but they will also represent victims of racist violence in America that has been going on for centuries. And I do think if the memorial is of the quality and type that it will be, I think it'll become a national shrine.
Do you know, Kavin, since you're heading this committee, do you know how many people are in this mass grave? Help us understand this concept. So after the massacre, they went to some site and just buried, tens, hundreds of people in one, one plot. When we talk about a mass grave site, what are we talking about exactly?
Well, over the years, it's been talked about all around the city of Tulsa. I mean, there are just there's other cemeteries that led us to believe that they're also being buried, and it's all because the oral history is giving those indications. Those folks who are sharing those stories, the white community sharing those stories that have been passed down to them, and we really don't know. I mean, we get a bunch of haystacks around the city. We just look and we know the pins and needles are there. We just got to pick the right haystack. And in July of last year, we dug 15 feet into a hole that we suspected and hoping that we'll find a large sum of riot dead, but we did not. And we continued to go into the fall of October 2020 when we dug into the earth. And soon afterwards, we were able to find 12 coffins side by side, stacked like dominoes inside of a trench. Now, Dr. Clyde Snow, one of the consultants for the final report, cautioned us about don't get too excited about finding a mass grave, because during that same period in 1918, we were going through a pandemic at that time. And so I'm optimistic that this pretty much is the so-called 18. Some of them will identify, some of them are not. And we don't know until we go in there and find out exactly what that is. Now, I'm so glad that on our watch, we got some of the finest researchers and scientists that can go in and make quick determination, and so we can begin the process of healing. And then, but we're not going to stop there. There are other sites within the Oaklawn Cemetery, that's where we currently are located, and so we want to exhaust all those means before we go to other sites like the Canes, which is the incredible story behind that. Out there on Booker T. Washington, known today as Rolling Oaks Cemetery, where it was rumored that mass graves are located, and it's a hidden cemetery that's been desecrated because of new development that occurred just a few short yards away from a housing development and a number of cemeteries in the same area. So here it is, something been uncovered just in time, 100 years later, and we are here to put the rumors to a test.
Yeah.
And go after, make an honest effort. Yeah. And I must say this, and I get all kinds of statements about this, but I honestly believe I like to give a lot of shout out to Mayor G.T. Bynum. I consider what his efforts are doing historic. He's the first mayor in 100 years that dealt with the mass graves, and that's both on the Democratic and Republican side. And so he gets a lot of heat, but at least on our watch, we are at least making those attempts towards reconciliation and making those to help right or wrong, to help hopefully that we'll create dialogue so we can move on for the next 100 years.
Thank you for that, Kavin. And just one last question for you, Dr. Ellsworth, and that's reparations. Can't have this conversation about this 100-year, this centennial, this racial reckoning conversation that we're having throughout the country, as you mentioned, somewhat in response to George Floyd's murder, but really in response to so many other, revelations about systemic racism that have always been there, but now bright light has been shined on. What's your thoughts about reparations for those descendants whose families were victimized, whose homes were burned, whose businesses were burned in this 1921 massacre?
Well, they deserve them. There's no question whatsoever that, not only the three known survivors that we have right now, but also the descendants and descendants of any survivors deserve financial restitution for what happened. Not only did people try to murder them, they destroyed their homes, their businesses. It created this great economic shadow that's still hovering over Greenwood today. They were let down by their city government, by the state, let down by the federal government, who never even bothered to, investigate the worst single incident of racial violence in our history. They were let down by the insurance companies that refused to pay claims. We've got work to do. Look, reparations in general is a really complicated subject, and anyone who says it isn't is joking with themselves, seriously. But this is a finite incident. It's an event that lasted for 16 hours. We can identify these people, and they deserve something. We need to right a wrong here.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Ross. Thank you so much, Dr. Ellsworth. Again, the book is The Groundbreaking: An American City and Its Search for Justice. So grateful to sit down with both of you just to learn more and to educate. I'm one of those people like you, Mr. Ross, went to college. I even went a little bit beyond college to get this law degree. And not once in my history of being in school as a student do I remember being taught about this, massacre that's called one of the most significant race riots in U.S. history, and that's a damn shame. That's all I can say. It's a damn shame. But thankfully now, folks like you, Dr. Ellsworth, and you, Mr. Ross, are enlightening generations and generations of people about this, and with that enlightenment, hopefully will come that restitution and reparation. So again, thank you for sitting down with me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we're moving right along. We're talking about the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So excited about my next guest. His name is Dr. Karlos Hill. He is a historian and scholar of lynching and racial violence. He is the chair of African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. He's also the author of several books, including his latest March 21st release called The 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, A Photographic History. Good morning and welcome to the show, Dr. Hill.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your new book. I've read so many of the reviews and they are outstanding. Excited to learn from you about why you decided to tell the story of the Tulsa Massacre in this richly illustrated book of pictures and oral testimonies.
Well, I will start with thank you for having me on, and thank you for having me on in the company of the great Scott Ellsworth, as well as Massacre descendant Kavin Ross. It's an honor and a privilege to be a part of this conversation. But I would say that my work in Witness has revolved around telling the stories of America's Black victims of racial violence, particularly lynching. And so the race massacre, we should just be very clear about this, is the deadliest attack on a Black community in American history. And there's no question in my mind that that's the case. And so for me, understanding the scope and the scale of the racial violence that has been perpetrated against Black people in this country, and then coming to Oklahoma in 2016, learning this history from individuals like Scott Ellsworth, Kavin, I began to understand in ways that I hadn't before the scope, the scale, the horrendousness of what occurred. And because of that education that I got in those first few years of being here, I was forced to bear witness and tell the truth of what occurred. And so I ultimately coalesced around trying to center the stories of survivors, the stories of victims, the stories of descendants, and leveraging those stories with the photographs that were mostly taken by whites. But my theory of change is that the only way that Americans today, 100 years later, could actually understand this history is if the photographs, the hundreds of photographs that were taken would help to tell this story. And so much of my work has been about trying to, in this 100th anniversary, center the perspectives of victims, survivors, and descendants, because I believe if we do that, if we authentically do that, there's a chance, right, that we can get justice, that we can get not just reparations, not just restitutions, but a reparations program that will invest in this community in ways that the city, as well as the state, has never done, especially not since 1921.
So, Dr. Hill, photographs. It's kind of puzzling to think that white people were taking photographs of their victims. So, I'm a lawyer. So typically people who are involved in crime want to hide the crime. They don't want to memorialize the crimes on photographs and videotape. But these white folks in the 1900s, in the 1920s, were taking pictures of the very victims that they were lynching, that they were burning, that they were killing. Help us understand why they did that, and in how you were able to tell the story that you tell in your book so that it is not through the gaze of that white supremacy.
Absolutely. So we have to recognize that, the Tulsa race massacre, deadliest attack on a Black community, was an unprecedented attack. But attacks on Black communities were common. Lynchings of Black people were common. Historians have documented over 250 such attacks on Black communities, beginning in the mid-19th century, all the way through to the mid-20th century. Historians have documented 5,000 lynchings, right, that have occurred since 1880 all the way to 1960. And so racial violence against Black people, Black communities, common. Unprecedented was the scope and the scale and the viciousness and the rapidity with which the Greenwood community was destroyed in less than 24 hours. And so Mark Twain, in the early 20th century, 1901, referred to America as the United States of lyncherdom. And he talked about it as the United States of lyncherdom because not only was lynching common, whites were never, ever, ever held accountable. The perpetrators of the violence or the authorities who allowed it to happen. And so white people lived in a culture where they believed that they were immune from accountability. And so it was okay to take photographs, to document their criminality, because they knew there was never, ever going to be accountability. And so that's what we cannot allow today, right? Many of the whites who perpetrated the violence are dead, and they will never be held accountable. But the city of Tulsa is still here. The city government is still here. The state government is still here, and they can be held accountable. And so that is what, from my mind, the centennial is about. It is about remembering. It is about bearing witness, but it most assuredly needs to be about justice. And to the extent that it's about justice, we are centering survivors. And to the extent that it is not, we are still 100 years later ignoring them.
Yeah. Thank you for that explanation about why they took pictures. Why not take them if you're not going to be held accountable, if you're not going to, face any consequences, particularly criminal consequences. I want to ask you though about, kind of today we see this notion of memorializing in the context of police violence. We've seen the photographs that were taken, the videotapes that have been taken, the camera that has been used to film police violence. And even with that, there's this kind of redefining the narrative or attempt to whitewash what we see. Is that similar to what was happening in the early 1900s? Was, these photographs weren't being seen as photographs of brutality and violence, but they were being seen as white folks protecting, their communities and doing what was expected of, good, upstanding white folks.
Absolutely. The narrative of the city, the narrative of those who participated in the massacre was that they were suppressing a Negro rebellion. And this was the official kind of position taken by the city in the aftermath of the massacre. And so the city leaders at the time chose to ignore the rampant violence, the destruction to the community. They chose to live in a different reality. But when you carefully study the record, when you listen to survivors tell their stories of what occurred, you know that at minimum what occurred is a massacre. I have talked about what occurred as a community lynching because the violence, although the violence initially was directed at Dick Rowland, ultimately the violence was targeted at the community, and the community as a whole, right, was destroyed. As Professor Ellsworth said, every Black resident in the Greenwood district was impacted by this. 10,000 Black people were made homeless. And so to answer your earlier question, I just want to make sure I get to this. My theory of change in writing this book was that I began writing this book in a moment where the Watchmen and Lovecraft Country are not on the horizon. And so as a historian of lynching and racial violence, how can I help Americans who have no understanding, deep understanding anyway, of this history of racist violence, terrorist violence? How do I help them understand what a 35 block area looks like when it's destroyed? Words can help us to understand that, but imagery, and the imagery captured by the mob to show a successful suppression of a quote unquote Negro rebellion. Those same images, if paired alongside survivor accounts, my belief was that the truth would shine through because of the potency of those accounts. And so to the extent that the book is successful, my hope is that it not only disrupted the white gaze, right, that it replaced the white gaze because of the power of their accounts. And so to the extent that the book is successful, and to the extent that it does that, it's been a successful book. To the extent that it does not, then I need to go back to the drawing board. But that was the hope.
Yeah, no, I think you've hit it dead on. Obviously, the book does capture those images, and we know how powerful images are. We've seen it again with the George Floyd video, the powerful image of George Floyd, the knee on the neck, Derek Chauvin, 9 minutes, 29 minutes, shook this country in a way that so many other killings by police have not. Again, the book is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, a photographic history. I want to ask you about one image. I think it's on about page 59 or so, and it's actually a postcard, and it's the caption, because you use these captions also very brilliantly throughout the book. So they're not just pictures, there's testimonies from survivors and victims, but there are also these captions. And I think this caption is about running the Blacks out of Tulsa, or running the Negro out of Tulsa, something to that effect. Such a powerful statement. Does that for you kind of, really summarize what this whole massacre was about? Not just destroying this prosperous Black community, but forever forcing Blacks out of this city.
Absolutely. And in the photograph that you mentioned, running the Negro out of Tulsa, in so many ways helped to anchor my understanding of truly what happened. It helped me to understand what was on the hearts and minds of not necessarily all whites who invaded the Greenwood district, but certainly was a portion of those individuals who invaded the Greenwood. This was in their hearts. This was in their mind, running the Negro out of Tulsa. And because of that, I have argued that this was at minimum a massacre, but decidedly we can talk about it as a community lynching and an attempted expulsion of Tulsa's Black community. And so it's much deeper than just a massacre. In looking at that photograph over and over and over, it is, for me, it underscores the level of glee, the level of confidence that whites had, that they would never be held accountable. And so when we think about this history 100 years later, we have to remember the destruction, we have to remember the violence, but we also have to remember not just what happened to Greenwood residents, but what Greenwood residents did in response to the violence. And rather than being intimidated, rather than being coward, rather than being pushed out, they remained. they stayed. And so we should remember the violence, we should remember the destruction, but we should always remember and center the resistance, because we would not, and I want to repeat this, we would not be commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre had not survivors rebuilt this community. And so many other communities in America where Black people have been attacked and the Black community rightly so fled, those histories have been forgotten and may never be recovered. And so it's a testament to survivors, descendants who've remained, who've walked around Tulsa carrying this trauma for all these years. And so it's a testament to them. And that's what we are commemorating.
Yeah, no, that resilience is absolutely amazing, incredible, and we have to call it out. And I agree with you. We have to reflect on that. You mentioned the word accountability a couple of times. So I want to bring into the conversation now Eric Miller. He's a lawyer. He's a professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, and he's leading a team of lawyers seeking reparation for the victims and descendants of the Tulsa Race Massacre. He recently testified before Congress in support of reparations for those descendants. Good morning and welcome, Eric.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Eric, you have had the unique experience of talking to survivors of the massacre. Just give us some sense of what they are feeling, particularly in this moment that we are commemorating, the 100 years since the Tulsa massacre.
So I actually this is my second time working on behalf of survivors of the massacre to represent them against the state of Oklahoma, the city of Tulsa. And I heard the same thing in 2003 when I worked with Professor Charles Ogletree and Johnny Cochran, as I'm hearing now, working with a group, including being headed by Demario Solomon Simmons. What I hear is anger at the city of Tulsa, especially, for never having paid a cent in compensation to the survivors for what happened. What we hear is that they are incredibly proud to be American. Many of them served during the Second World War and the Korean War. They fought for this country, and they expect the country to honor the claims of justice that they themselves represented when they engaged in service. And so it's a mixture of anger and frustration that after 100 years, still there has been no compensation to the victims of the massacre from the government.
Yeah, I know that you were on Capitol Hill when 3 of the survivors testified, and I was personally touched by Viola Fletcher, 107 years old, unbelievable. She looked not a day over 75. And we have a clip of what she said during that congressional hearing. I want to play it for you and then get your response on the other side.
No one cared about us for almost 100 years. We and our history have been forgotten, washed away. This Congress must recognize us and our history. For Black America, for the white Americans, and for all Americans, that's some justice.
So here's Miss Fletcher, 107 years old. Her brother, also on Capitol Hill, 100 years old, testifying as well. What was that like, Eric, being in the room? How did that testimony resonate with those lawmakers?
It was incredibly emotional. Everyone had tears welling in their eyes. I know the survivors were incredibly proud to be representing their community. The legal team was overwhelmed, but as Representative Jackson Lee said, everyone in the room was overcome with emotion because you cannot deny the reality of eyewitness accounts of what happened at the time. And for so long, the city, the state, America has been trying to deny what happened to these survivors, forced them, the state acknowledged that there was a conspiracy of silence to force them to stop speaking. These are people who are still living with the trauma. Mother Fletcher testified that she wakes up every morning and still smells the burning that she smelled when she was a 6 or 7 year old girl. So this ongoing trauma of anti-Black violence, white terrorism, is a legacy for the survivors of the massacre, but also, you scratch someone whose family lived through Jim Crow, and you find similar acts of violence in their past. And so, as Karlos said, this is a unique event in terms of its scope, but it's not a unique event in terms of the fact of violence.
Professor Hill, one thing we know is that none of the perpetrators of this violence were ever arrested, tried by a jury, incarcerated, and I'm wondering if you or any of your other colleagues have made any efforts to identify the descendants of the perpetrators.
No, I have not. I mean, my work and witness has focused on helping people understand this history from the vantage point of victims, survivors, and descendants. And even though my book features photographs taken by whites, my goal was to leverage those photographs to enhance the stories of survivors. And so my research and witness is really revolves around these survivors, Black survivors, and amplifying their stories. And I can't tell you how much gratitude, how much pride I felt in listening to Mother Fletcher, Mother Randall, Hugh Van Ellis, because for 100 years, this story has been suppressed. Survivor accounts have been ignored, but 100 years later, they spoke into existence for the world what had happened to them. And so now it's on us. We can no longer say we don't know, we hadn't heard about this history. They have provided us a window, a compelling window into what occurred so many years ago. And now it's on us. Now it's on Congress. Now it's on the state of Oklahoma. Now it's on the city of Tulsa to do the right thing. I often hear people say the statute of limitations, the statute of limitations, the statute of limitations. There's no statute of limitations on doing the right thing, the moral thing, the ethical thing. And so that's what is before us today. And so I hope that, and I know that Mother Fletcher, Mother Randall, Hugh Van Ellis have created, right, a situation where now we can respond. We should respond. I hope that is the result of this 100th anniversary.
Well, let's talk, Eric, some about the legality, because Dr. Hill says that there's no statute of limitations on doing the right thing. And I think we all agree with that. But we do know when you move into a court of law, there are rules and regulations and policies and laws that dictate what can be filed and what can move forward in a court of law. And has there ever been a case like this case where plaintiffs have been able to sue a city or a state seeking restitution or reparations for this kind of harm? That's the first question. The second question, what legal challenges or obstacles are they facing at this time in terms of trying to pursue litigation?
So I want to compare the two lawsuits, the one from 2003 and the current one filed in 2020. In 2003, we argued that the statute of limitations ought to be tolled, which means it ought to be stopped running.
Right.
And we based that litigation, that argument, on lawsuits filed on behalf of, among other groups, Holocaust survivors, in which courts around America told the statute of limitations because of the extraordinary circumstances that those victims went through. And we argued that the same sort of circumstances applied in Tulsa. It was a form of ethnic cleansing in which the courts were, the doors of the courthouse were shut to these survivors, and the district court and the appellate court both acknowledged that that was the case. What they did, though, was they started the clock running again in the mid-70s, actually using Dr. Ellison's book. He was one of our witnesses He said that there were new facts discovered that even he didn't know about, and the courts ignored his testimony. So
Was that suit ultimately dismissed, the 2000?
that suit was ultimately dismissed. The current suit is a public nuisance lawsuit, and public nuisance is a form of ongoing harm. And so we're alleging that the city of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, engaged in actions whose effects are currently being experienced by the victims, the survivors, and the descendants, the community of Greenwood and North Tulsa. And so we don't face a statute of limitations problem. But I will say, just following up on your last conversation, so we've always had to sue public entities, the government, various governments, state and municipal, and maybe some corporations. Individuals never get held to account. When you walk through the streets of Tulsa, I lived in Montgomery, Alabama for a year. When you walk through the streets of Montgomery, Alabama, the history of racial violence is still present there. You look around at the old folks in the town and you wonder, where were you then? I spoke to someone not so long ago who claimed to know our lead plaintiff in the 2003 suit, John Melvin Alexander. It turned out that Mr. Alexander worked as a domestic worker in that person's house. And the person said, well, why ought we to pay? And the short answer is because your grandfather, who employed Mr. Alexander and never paid and never offered to pay, because your father, who employed Mr. Alexander, never paid and never offered to pay, and you haven't paid and haven't offered to pay, and you didn't even know how angry, upset, and traumatized Mr. Alexander was when he lived in your home and treated you like
well, Eric, let me ask you this. In the lawsuit, either 2003 or the 2020 lawsuit, have you been able to, as the lawyer or your team of lawyers, been able to identify the descendants of any perpetrators and to identify maybe any estates or private estates that they may own? And have they been named as defendants in either of these two lawsuits?
So the short answer is no. The longer answer is because the lawsuits cannot proceed against individuals. And the way that they're structured, they have to proceed against institutions, public institutions, so governments or private institutions. That I do think that, I think Professor Hill is quite right to censure the survivors, the descendants, the victims in this. But what we see again and again in American history is not just the erasure of Black suffering, we see the erasure of white accountability. And so we never get to know the names of the perpetrators, and the perpetrators, their families or descendants, get to deny all responsibility. And today, Mayor Bynum in Tulsa is saying that reparations is divisive because who's going to pay? The current generation of white people. He's blaming the victims for coming forward and demanding justice. Well, the people who we ought to blame for putting the burden on current day Tulsans are not the victims who seek to get money to compensate for their burned buildings, for their looted property, for their murdered loved ones. It's the grandfathers and grandmothers, the parents who refused to pay their due when it came round, and who have placed that burden on their own children and grandchildren. So stop blaming the victims, start owning up to your responsibility.
That's a really excellent point, Eric. And I'll ask you, Professor Hill, why aren't we? I understand. I think, Eric and I both agree with you. Centering these narratives and conversations on the victims is so important. Obviously, they have such an emotional story to tell. They can, their words are so powerful. But if we are going to hold someone accountable, don't we need to identify who those individuals are? These are real people. This wasn't, some mythical thing called the state. These were people who were dropping bombs and burning churches and burning, businesses and shooting and killing folks. And I would imagine the same kind of, research, intense research that you did to find those survivors could also be done to find the descendants of those perpetrators. So is that something that historians like yourself should be doing more of?
Perhaps. What I would say is, just to, try to encapsulate this conversation, the American way of dealing with racial violence is to erase its very existence, to deny its very existence. And so what Black Tulsans, Black survivors in Tulsa have experienced is the default position of this country. But Professor Ellsworth talked about the ways in which this history had been suppressed, documents destroyed. But the original sin of the city of Tulsa was a refusal to actually investigate what occurred. And in refusing to investigate what occurred and blaming it on the Black men who came downtown, that has created a situation where we will never know the names and identities of those who participated. We can explore more deeply individuals who participated, call them out, as well as their descendants, but we will never know. Most assuredly, we will never know all the individuals, or even a smattering of the individuals who, remember, Dr. Ellsworth, Professor Ellsworth said thousands, as many as 10,000 white people invaded the Greenwood district. And we don't have a name of one of them by design. And so we can dig deeper, we can dig harder. But what I'm saying is that the 100th anniversary needs to be about centering victims and survivors and descendants, because in centering the story there, my hope is that justice can happen, right? People understanding this, not just the history, but the people who were impacted most adversely by the history. This is their time, this is their moment, and I don't want to share the stage. I don't want the perpetrators to share the stage with them in this moment. And so, yes, we need to do that, but this is not the time.
Okay. No, and I understand, because the pain is so palpable, and the trauma, listening to, first of all, a 107-year-old woman having to bear witness in that way is, we haven't seen that in the history of this country. But I do. And maybe not in this moment, Professor Hill, but I agree with Eric. We are a country that protects those perpetrators, and we've got to also we can't let them go without facing the consequences, and their grandchildren and their great grandchildren, in the way that we are traumatized as great grandchildren of some of those victims. Their great grandchildren have to be held account for the actions of their their ancestors, and not that they are personally responsible, but they are a part of a family. That is their family's legacy for sure.
And I would say, why, just to follow up to you, why don't we know more about the families, the slaveholding families of this country, right? There's greater documentation around individuals who own slaves, but we know very few of the individuals who benefited and profited today from it. And so, again, this is the American way of dealing with racial violence: to disavow, to deny, to pretend it does not exist. And so, yes, we must hold people to account to the extent that we can. I don't want to get lost in trying to search for particular white people. I want to focus the conversation on the city. I want to focus the conversation on the state, because that is where the racial justice as it relates to reparations will revolve around, not descendants of whites who participated. It would be great for them to come forward to share what they know, but they're under no obligation. And in many ways, they will never come forward because of the ways in which it will shine a light on them and their families. And so the light that we need to shine it on is the city and the state and even the federal government.
Yeah. I'll let you have the last word on that, Eric. I'm in agreement with you, Dr. Hill, but I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And I think, you're a historian. I'm a lawyer. Eric's a lawyer. So if this is going to be done, we are the folks. We're the folk that work in this business, and it is our jobs. You from a historian standpoint, and Eric and I from a legal standpoint. to put it all out, lay it all lay it
Yeah.
all out on the table. We've got to honor those victims and pay tribute to those victims and get the kind of reparations and restitution and transformative justice is what we're talking about that those victims deserve. But
Absolutely.
I am absolutely certain that we also need to talk about those folks and those families. And you're right. Why don't we know more about those slave owning families who destroyed Black families and Black networks? And the trauma that we still experience from that, but yet we don't know the names of those folks who benefited financially. And still to this day, many of them are benefiting financially. Eric, give us the last comments. I'm way over time, but this is such a fascinating conversation. I will let you have the last word.
So 2 quick comments. One, a really powerful project out of University College London charted the payments made by the British government to former enslavers during the British emancipation. And they've done a map. You can now find the people who got paid, how much they got paid, and the enslaved people they owned. And so I was trying to find out who owned my ancestors. And it's kind of weird because, on one side I'm benefiting, on the other side I'm burdened. But what I will say is one of the reasons, Professor Hill is completely right. We need to center during the centennial the survivors and the descendants. What I want to do is take away one argument that the descendants on the white side are making, which is we don't owe nothing. Mm-hmm. And the answer is, hang on a second, your parents, your grandparents never paid. So when you say that your taxes are being taken from you unfairly, that's not true. It's not the Black survivors that put this on you, it's your parents and your grandparents that put this on you. The current mayor, Mayor Bynum, his grandfather was one mayor before the Tulsa massacre. He's been living in Tulsa a long time. He claims that Black people seeking justice, Black people seeking payment is racially divisive. What's racially divisive is white people refusing to account for what happened. And actually, as the mayor saying that, implying that Black people's taxes aren't going to be used too, because everybody's taxes are going to be used too. So, we need justice for the survivors. The arguments against giving justice for the survivors are just risible. Let's pay now.
Wow, we've got to leave it there. Incredibly powerful conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Hill. I listened to one of your interviews, and I think mine was better.
Amen. Amen.
I enjoy speaking with you. Thank you so much, Eric, for the great work that you're doing. Let's all take this weekend and pay tribute and center those survivors. Again, thank you for joining me this morning. Woo! Okay, I got to remind you guys about that book. That is the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, a photographic history by Dr. Karlos Hill. Make sure you run to your nearest bookstore, go online, get that book because it is powerful, and we know images are so incredibly powerful. I want to thank all of my guests today for joining me. Thanks to all of you for your questions and your comments. Such, incredible conversation. I said it earlier in the show. I've been to a bunch of really, really prestigious schools, and not any of them taught the history of this massacre. And I hope, like you, that you enjoy. I hope, like me, that today you enjoyed this history lesson, that you learned a lot, and that you'll be encouraged to even go deeper, learn more. Get the book that Dr. Ellsworth has written, the book that Dr. Hill has written, because those are books that will definitely help give you an understanding of what happened to Black folks in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, and how those Black folks responded. Their resilience, their courage, their perseverance is inspirational in just so many incredible ways. Just some words to live by before I get out. If we can't acknowledge it, we can't fix it. I've said it before and I'll say it again this morning because it is so incredibly appropriate today. We can't dismantle racist systems if we lie, if we hide, and we conceal the truth. Even though that truth is ugly and despicable as the 1921 race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, we've got to be willing to face it. It is unrealistic to think that we can make Black folks whole and address decades of injustices that destroyed families, homes, and support networks without calling it out. And then once we call it out, we have to have the grit, the determination, and the will to fix it. Unequivocally, the descendants of and victims of the Tulsa massacre are entitled to transformative justice to remedy the systemic, the state-sanctioned attack on their person and their property. And given the ages of the 3 survivors that recently testified in Congress, the time is now for the city of Tulsa, the state of Oklahoma, and the United States to act. Plain and simple, acknowledge the enormous harm that was done to these families, and then just fix it. And until this happens, talk about allyship and being an anti-racist are just empty words. I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. And remember, we are all in this together.